Ni hao. So, in this episode of my Chinese philosophy series, we're going to be talking about the philosophy of Hsun Tzu. Now, this is not Sun Tzu of the Art of War. This is Hsun Tzu, H-S-U-N, space T-Z-U, who was a Confucianist. And he was actually one of the most important Confucian philosophers, because after Confucius died, the philosophy, the school split into two major factions, one led by Mencius, and the other led by your boy Hsun Tzu. This is sort of like how after the Prophet Muhammad died, Islam diverged into different sects with different philosophies and different ideas about how things should be done. So Mencius, who leads the group of Confucians that become the dominant school, one of his central ideas is that people are essentially good. Human nature is basically good. Confucius himself is a little vague on this. He doesn't have necessarily a clear moral judgment on human nature, whether or not it's good or bad. So Mencius says good. Hsun Tzu takes the opposite position, and he says essentially that human nature is evil. That's why in Michael Austen's Reading the World, the first section that he excerpts from Hsun Tzu is entitled "Man's Nature is Evil." And Hsun pulls no punches here. He starts out this essay very, very directly. He writes, "Man's nature is evil. Goodness is the result of conscious activity. The nature of man is such that he is born with a fondness for profit. If he indulges this fondness, it will lead him into wrangling and strife, and all sense of courtesy and humility will disappear. He is born with feelings of envy and hate, and if he indulges these, they will lead him into violence and crime, and all sense of loyalty and good faith will disappear. Man is born with the desires of the eyes and ears, with a fondness for beautiful sights and sounds. If he indulges these, they will lead him into license and wantonness, and all ritual principles and correct forms will be lost. Hence, any man who follows his nature and indulges his emotions will inevitably become involved in wrangling and strife, will violate the forms and rules of society, and will end as a criminal. Therefore, man must first be transformed by the instructions of a teacher and guided by ritual principles, and only then will he be able to observe the dictates of courtesy and humility, obey the forms and rules of society, and achieve order. It is obvious from this, then, that man's nature is evil, and that his goodness is the result of conscious activity." So, I mean, again, we've got that very Confucian focus on ritual, social forms, order as the sort of highest good. These are all things that are really central to Confucianism. But we've also got that sort of Thomas Hobbes style, humans are fundamentally driven by desires, by want, and things like this. What Freud would call the id. So for Hsun Tzu, humans are id-driven. What we do is we have what Freud would call the ego, which comes along and says, no, you can't eat all the food, have sex with people all the time, whether they want you to or not, kill people, whatever it is. You can't do those things. You have to follow the rules, you have to live in society, etc., etc. This is exactly the same kind of thing that Hsun Tzu is saying. And if you've watched my previous video on Han Fei Tzu and the Legalists, and you're clever, this might also sound quite familiar. And in fact, Hsun Tzu was a teacher of Han Fei Tzu. So Han Fei Tzu's philosophy, his legalism, is shaped in part by Hsun Tzu's notion that human beings are basically id-driven, and the only way that we resist the destruction of social order that comes with being id-driven beasts, basically, is through learning and obeying rituals and social norms. So this is another really important component, and we'll talk more in just a little bit about Hsun Tzu's belief in the importance of education. But one of the things in particular that he argues is that human nature itself is basically evil, and we need these restrictions not to make us morally good, but to make us behave morally. So this, I think, is a distinction that Hsun Tzu would draw between being good and acting appropriately. So he says here, someone may ask, if man's nature is evil, then where do ritual principles come from? I would reply, all ritual principles are produced by the conscious activity of the sages. Essentially, they are not products of man's nature. A potter molds clay and makes a vessel, but the vessel is the product of the conscious activity of the potter, not essentially a product of his human nature. A carpenter carves a piece of wood and makes a utensil, but the utensil is the product of the conscious activity of the carpenter, not essentially a product of his human nature. The sage gathers together his thoughts and ideas, experiments with various forms of conscious activity, and so produces ritual principles and sets forth laws and regulations. Hence, these ritual principles and laws are the products of the conscious activity of the sage, not essentially products of his human nature. So this is a big thing for Hsun Tzu, is the idea that moral behavior is not innate. We don't behave well, we don't obey the rituals, we don't follow social forms because we are inherently good and inherently driven to do so. We do it as a result of our conscious choice to do so. And this is important because one of the big issues that Hsun Tzu brings up is whether or not. So he establishes a distinction between the capacity to do something and the actuality of doing it. So he believes that everyone has the potential to be good or to act good. Everyone has the potential to act as they should, and everyone has the potential to act as they shouldn't. And it's a question of conscious choice which one they decide to do. So he says here, you have said, someone may object, that the sage has arrived where he has through the accumulation of good acts. Why is it then that everyone is not able to accumulate good acts in the same way? I would reply, everyone is capable of doing so. Now this is an interesting point. He's essentially saying here, everyone can be ethically good, everyone can be a sage, a gentleman, whatever it is, whatever term you want to use in the sort of sphere of Confucian philosophy. I would reply, everyone is capable of doing so, but not everyone can be made to do so. The petty man is capable of becoming a gentleman, yet he is not willing to do so. The gentleman is capable of becoming a petty man, but he is not willing to do so. The petty man and the gentleman are perfectly capable of changing places. The fact that they do not actually do so is what I mean when I say that they are capable of doing so, but they cannot be made to do so. Hence, it is correct to say that the man in the street is capable of becoming a Yu. That's why Yu with an umlaut. And Yu was a great sort of Chinese sage in Confucian history. But it is not necessarily correct to say that he will, in fact, find it possible to do so. But although he does not find it possible to do so, does not prove that he is incapable of doing so. So this is one of the interesting things about Hsun Tzu's philosophy, is he says that everyone has this innate capability. Everyone could act ethically, but not everyone will act ethically. As my dad used to say, you can lead a mouse to cookies, but you can't make him drink. And that's essentially what we get here from Hsun Tzu, is this idea that everyone can be a good person, but not everyone is going to be a good person. And the fact that they don't act ethically, the fact that they're not, that they don't accumulate goodness, does not prove that they couldn't have accumulated goodness if they had chosen to act differently. So that's important. But the other thing that's crucial in Hsun Tzu's philosophy is the idea of education, because for him, behavior is controlled by ritual. It's controlled by obeying your position in society, treating other people in the way that you are ethically supposed to treat them, etc., etc. All this Confucian sort of foundation stuff, this Confucian orthodoxy. For Hsun Tzu, so for Mencius, that stuff is innate. Like, we behave properly because we are fundamentally good. For Hsun Tzu, we're fundamentally evil. And so we have to learn the rituals. We have to learn proper behavior because it's not our nature. And so because of this, Hsun Tzu is a big supporter of education. And of course, what he means by education is largely you seek out a sage, that person teaches you how to behave properly, and then you behave properly. But this is very much an external activity for Hsun Tzu. So he says, for instance, in his essay, Encouraging Education, I once tried spending the whole day in thought, but I found it of less value than a moment of study. I once tried standing on tiptoe and gazing into the distance, but I found I could see much further by climbing to a high place. If you climb to a high place and wave to someone, it is not as though your arm were any longer than usual, and yet people can see you from much further away. If you shout down the wind, it is not as though your voice were any stronger than usual, and yet people can hear you much more clearly. Those who make use of carriages or horses may not be any faster walkers than anyone else, and yet they are able to travel 1,000 li. That's, according to the footnote here, a traditional Chinese unit of distance, about 1/3 of a mile. Those who make use of boats may not know how to swim, and yet they manage to get across rivers. The gentleman is by birth no different from any other man. It is just that he is good at making use of things. In particular, the things that he's good at making use of are education, the wisdom of the sages. And so this is really important for Hsun Tzu because, again, we're not moral because we are innately good. We're not moral because we are ethically moral people. We're moral to the extent that we behave properly according to the rules and rituals